Do you love God? Do I love God? We each ought to ask ourselves that question. Jesus asked Peter, do you love me? Peter says, I love you. So he asked again, do you love me? Peter says, I love you. Then he asked again, do you love me? Why ask and then ask again? I know one thing it was making him think. I wonder, what if Jesus was looking at me eye to eye or looking at you eye to eye and he asked the same question? It could be that I might say, yeah, I love it. I'm here this morning. I'm singing along, I'm giving, I'm praying, I'm participating in class, I took the Lord's Supper. Of course I love it. But I want to challenge you to dig a little deeper here and think about that just a little bit more. Do you love God? Do I love God? What does that mean? In 1 John 2 and verse 15 he says, love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, and the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world. And the world passeth away, and the lust thereof. But he that doeth the will of God abideth forever. We've been going through 1 John, and pointing out that John is counteracting the teaching of the Gnostics of the first century. Gnostics from gnosis, which means they claim some knowledge that maybe they didn't think others had. The irony again is they did not really know what they claimed to know, and the knowledge they claimed to have was really in direct contradiction with what it means to believe in Jesus. Somehow they didn't believe Jesus came in the flesh, but that would destroy the whole reason why he came. He came in the flesh, and he experienced temptation, yet he was without sin, but he came in order to redeem us from the sins that we commit in the flesh. So if Jesus didn't come in the flesh, you've got a real problem. But the end result of their teaching, these Gnostics, is that somehow you can indulge in the flesh, and it's not really you. Well, think about how he's counteracting it here. When he talks about loving not the world, what does that mean, love not the world? Well, he's not talking about the people, because that's in John 3, this same writer, through the Holy Spirit, who said, God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. He's not talking about the globe. And he's not talking about that. He's talking about the people. The people that he made. He loved so much that he gave his only begotten Son. So whenever John is now saying, love not the world, he's not talking about the same world that John was saying that God loved the world. Well, what he is talking about, he's not saying that you can't appreciate the creation that God made. If you look at what God has made and you appreciate him for it, that he is greater than what he created, and you can look up at the stars and you can see that his handiwork is powerful. And you appreciate that there is a God because of the things he's made. Now, certainly you're not going to worship what he made. He's greater than what he made. And he's the only one worthy of worship. But when he says love not the world, he's talking about worldly affairs. He's talking about anything that has a fleshly, earthly, carnal pull away from God, anything that God would consider abominable or wrong or sinful, or the cares of this life. Last week, Abe talked about Mark, where how the thorny soil is that has the cares of the world. When he spoke of that in Mark calls it cares of this world. In Luke's account, he called it just cares, riches, pleasures of this life. Mark's account says lusts of other things. So it's a very similar idea. There are things that we want, our flesh desires. When we let those desires take hold of us, pull us away from God, then we're loving the world. Demas had this problem. Paul is disappointed when he said, Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world. That love pulled him away from the task of helping the cause of Christ. He had departed. He went away. There's a reason why Satan is called the prince of this world, or the god of this world. He uses avenues of temptation to pull us away from God. As we consider that, look how John speaks of this when he says, for all that is in the world. And this is the grasp of what he means by loving the world and the things here being worldly. Verse 16, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. Those are not of the Father, but is of the world. Those three things. That's what he's encapsulating in the idea of loving the world. Think about these three avenues of temptation. Lust of the eyes. It has an appeal. It looks like it's going to be good for us. It looks like it may make us feel good. That's the lust of the flesh. See how those work hand in hand? Something may look like it's going to make me feel good. You have the pride of life. Well, why did Eve partake of the forbidden fruit that Satan deceived her with? God plainly said, don't eat of that fruit, and the day you eat of it, you shall surely die. Satan tempted her and deceived her by making her think she was missing out on some knowledge, on something she needed to know. Well, she didn't need to know that. All she needed to know was God said don't do that. And just follow God and trust in what God told them. This is kind of similar with the Gnostics. The Gnostics were claiming we have this heightened knowledge, something that's going to make you better. In reality, it didn't make them better. It made them indulge in the flesh. You really don't need to know anything outside of what the Scriptures already teach you. The Scriptures have everything that pertains to life and godliness. It's given and it can make you complete. You have all that you need right here. You don't need man to come along and invent some new doctrine. You don't need some group of people. You don't need some professor. You don't need some man with a title or anybody to try to tell you you need something outside of what God has already said. When I think about this war, and also I was considering both Abe's lesson and John's on Wednesday, The fact that there is this war, I think, is true, and then you can see that here as you're looking at this section of verses. There's an appeal that Satan is pulling you away from God with this worldliness, and then there's the love of God. And John makes it in such a way you can't have it both ways. Very much like the verse that was on the screen that Paul gave this morning. That you can't serve two masters. You can't have it both ways. There are times where we might try to do both. And John is asking you to choose. You either love God or you love the world. Which one is it? Can't have it in the middle. If you're trying to do it in the middle, then you're not really doing it. James says something similar when he says that whoever is a friend of the world is an enemy of God. I don't want to be an enemy of God. I need to know which side I'm on. I need to know who I'm following. I think, though, that these Gnostics would not have thought of themselves as they didn't love God. But John is calling them out where they really needed to know. If they loved God, they wouldn't love the world. And there's where the motivation is. Now, I'd like for you to consider and compare. Go to Galatians chapter 5 and see the same type of war that John is describing. Galatians chapter 5. Now, Paul, who is battling this situation with some who were Jews who wanted to still follow the law of Moses and bring that over into the covenant with Christ. And then you had Gentiles who were still living like Gentiles. So you see the problem. Both are wrong. And you know what the real problem with both are? Worldliness. Now, I don't think that the Jews who are still trying to follow the Old Testament law would have thought of themselves necessarily as worldly. But notice how he describes it in Galatians 5. They were trying to bind circumcision, which was no longer commanded. And he says in verse 13, "For brethren, you have been called unto liberty, only use not liberty for an occasion to the flesh, but by love serve one another." Well, being freed from the law doesn't mean you live however you want to live. Just like in Romans, being saved by grace doesn't mean you trample grace. Doesn't mean you undermine it and continue to do what grace saved you from intentionally. But verse 14, "For all the law is fulfilled in one word, even this, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." Those who are claiming to still follow the law weren't really following the whole thing which the law was based upon, which is love God, love your neighbor. Verse 15, "But if ye bite and devour one another, take heed that ye be not consumed one of another. This I say then, walk in the Spirit, and ye shall not fulfill the lust of the flesh." I think there were probably people, just like people today, when they hear that, "You mean we're not under the 10 Commandments? We're not under the law? Does that mean we can steal? We can kill? We can commit adultery?" People ask those kinds of questions. If we're not under the law, well, does that mean I can just do these things that the law told me not to do? Well, no. And Paul is answering, the reason why is because those are things that satisfy the flesh. And you've got to decide, which one are you going to want to try to gratify? Are you living for God's glory? Are you living in the Spirit? Or are you trying to satisfy yourself? If you're living for yourself, well, you're going to be involved in the things he's going to describe here. Verse 19, "Now the works of the flesh are manifest, which are these: adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lasciviousness. So far, why would somebody want to commit adultery? It's simple. Because there's something that they want to do that they think makes them feel good. Same thing about fornication. Sleeping with someone that you're not married to and you're not bound by God to, the only reason, and this is it, let's call it where it's at, it's because you think it's going to make you feel good, so you want to follow that. But God says don't do it. So you have to make the choice. Are you going to follow what God says to do? Or are you going to follow what you want to do that makes you feel good? Well, that's living in the flesh, walking in the flesh. That's worldly. Uncleanness, lasciviousness. That's a sensual, fleshly desire. Verse 20, idolatry. Why would somebody want to commit idolatry? Well, that's walking in the flesh. You're not satisfied that you can't see God and you're supposed to believe in Him. So you want to have some image that you can look at and that you can feel. You want to see something that you can look to and bow to and so forth. Instead of believing in God and how He describes Himself and His character. Witchcraft. Why would witchcraft be a thing of the flesh? Because you're not satisfied with what God says and what His Word says, so you feel like you have to find some outer medium, or you got to use some other source to determine or make people do things that you want them to do. Trying to contact the dead, trying to cast some kind of spell or something like that. The root of those problems is walking in the flesh. Hatred, variance, emulations, wrath, strife, seditions, heresies. These are all like ways in which we are angered with each other in an unbecoming way. I'm not talking about being angry righteously as Jesus was, but having some kind of envy, jealousy. That's selfish. That's satisfying myself. Envyings, murders. Why would somebody do that? Because they're selfish. Drunkenness. What would possess someone to say, I want to get drunk? That's where it's at. They want to feel good. They want the buzz. They want, some kind of fleshly gratification. Whether they excuse it by saying they want to wipe away their pain, or whether they want to say they don't want to be in that moment cognizant of the depression or whatever they're under. So they use that. That's a fleshly indulgence. Revelings and such like. The party lifestyle. The worldly riotous living. This is the way the world wants to live. We wait till Friday, we party on the weekends, get drunk, and then go back to the same thing the rest of the week. If that's the way that you view life, it's because you're walking in the flesh. But the answer to every one of these is not just simply, don't do it. Suppose someone who realizes, let's say they've had problems with these, and there's temptations in some of the, one person might be one or two of those on that list, might be all of those things on the list for another person. If you're struggling to try to put these things away for good, the answer is in the next part. To no longer live for yourself in an indulgence of your flesh, but to live for God. That's what John is talking about when he says to love God instead of these things. He says in verse 22, but the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith. If you love God and you want to please Him, and you have this joy because you've been forgiven and you have a reason to live right, then you want to replace those things that you've given up in the indulgence of the flesh with these things. Put the love of God in your life. If God was patient with us, be patient with other people instead of being angry and gossiping and backbiting and devouring one another like he talked about here in verse 15. Instead of all of those things, be patient as He is with us. Be gentle as He is with us. Go about doing good. That's what Jesus did. Trust in the Lord rather than anything else outside of the faith. Rather than in men, works of men. Meekness. Rather than trying to dominate and be superior, whether that's by knowledge or by control, be gentle, as Jesus was. Be temperate. Have self-control. Self-control is to subdue my lusts and desires that my flesh has. There are things that my body wants to do that I know I can't do because God is in me. And if we live in the Spirit, let us walk in the Spirit. Similarly, you see the similar type of dichotomy in Colossians. As we consider the same point in Colossians 3, notice how he reasons with them. Colossians 3, verse 1, if ye then be risen with Christ, seek those things which are above. Just as loving God is the answer to worldliness, it's the same thing here. Being raised with God, seek things that He wants us to have. Set your affection on things above, not on things on the earth. For you are dead, and your life is hid with Christ in God. When Christ, who is our life, shall appear, then shall ye also appear with Him in glory. Mortify, that is, put to death, therefore, your members which are upon the earth. These are things that you need to kill. You need to kill your fleshly indulgences. Put to death these things. Fornication, uncleanness, inordinate affection, evil concupiscence, and covetousness, which is idolatry. For which things' sake the wrath of God cometh on the children of disobedience. He goes on to show how the practicality of all of these things, when you put those things off, now you got to put some things on. Verse 12, put on therefore as the elect of God, holy, beloved, bowels of mercies. What does God do? He forgives. We deserve punishment, yet He is willing to forgive. He's slow to wrath. We need to be that way with others, because that's what He did with us. Kindness, humbleness of mind. Isn't it interesting how sometimes when we've been forgiven and then now we're trying to live right, we lose that patience with other people? Well, I think this humbleness of mind should help me remember where I came from, that He forgave me. And so I need to have that willingness to forgive others. Be long-suffering as He is with me. I need long-suffering. I need the patience of God. Forbearing one another, verse 13, and forgiving one another. If any man have a quarrel against any, even as Christ forgave you, so also do ye. If I ever find myself struggling with any of these, I need to just think, what do I need from God? I need forgiveness. I need patience. I need His love. Well, how that should translate is that should then pass on to other people in the way that I treat them. Those who really, really, truly appreciate the love of God and what He's done for us should then want to do that for others. But then that should cause me to put my heart and soul in these things and to live for Him. That's going to produce a greater joy, a greater peace, and a greater reason to live. And I'm going to suggest to you, you're going to be way happier with a lot less regret than anyone who ever tries to indulge in all of those things that you think are going to make your life better. Indulging in the flesh produces heartache. It produces misery. It produces wrecked homes. It produces poor health. How many people have destroyed their liver? How many people have destroyed their body and have destroyed their own mental state and have destroyed relationships because of indulgences in the flesh? Some indulgences in the flesh can cause disease and be spread around. Some indulgences of the flesh, what it does is, see, there's this promise that Satan wants you to feel like you're going to be able to better your life by indulging in these things, and it does the opposite. It doesn't give you what he's promising and what he's dangling before you, these little lures. He takes things that are so dangerous and he makes it shiny. The devil is fishing for your soul. And you're like this fish who is either going to take the bait because you think this is appealing. Maybe it looks good, looks like it's going to feel good, and you don't need to take the bait. And if you have, you need to let go. Let the Lord get you out of the snare of the devil. And the answer is love God. Do you love Him? If you love Him, then you've got to understand that it was sin to begin with that wrecked the relationship. The indulgences in the flesh is what wrecked our relationship with God. I don't want to do those things anymore. That's what needs to motivate me. So love God, not self. If you're not a Christian, why not appreciate what God has done for you and be forgiven? If you've been living worldly, I'll just ask, how's that working out? How well has that served you in your life? Is that getting you and fulfilling you in every way, or do you have regrets? Are you still empty and still wanting more? Well, that might ought to tell you something. That the more you indulge in things of the flesh, it just never satisfies fully. There's a better way. God's way is best. Believe in Him and trust His way with all your heart. Change your will to surrender to His. Stop fighting with Him. Say that I believe that Jesus is the Christ. And be ready to live for Him. Start by being baptized. When you come up out of the water, He forgives. Every sin that you've committed, you don't have to have any regret anymore. You don't have to have the guilt anymore. That's the better way of saying it. And you can lay your head down tonight knowing that you've been washed and you've been cleansed. And for the rest of your time, don't live for the will, your own will. Live for God. Don't make excuses if you've messed up. Don't try to justify it. Don't try to say, well, everybody else does it. Don't try to say, well, devil made me do it. Don't try to say, well, I just had this old urge and I was compelled, I can't help it. Don't do that. Just stop that behavior. Ask God to forgive you. Get up and try again. And if you've failed, just get back, do it again. He does forgive. Walk in the light. That's the point that John is teaching. Not persistence in sin, but a life that is trying its best to follow God. Why not do that? And if you need to make correction in any way, won't you come while we stand and as we sing?